Resampling is the re-recording of audio and its subsequent import back into a sampler. Back in the early days of sampling, there were a few distinct advantages to doing this, as well as some disadvantages. I'm going to go over some of these, but stay strictly to how they affect the synthesist or sound designer, as distinct from a producer arranging a tune. Resampling has a lot to offer, more than we can cover here, and so we'll stick to the main aspects that affect your patch design. One advantage of resampling back in the day was that multiple sounds could be layered on top of each other and then rendered or re-recorded as one file. So playing back that single file would save on polyphony and CPU power. By taking a few quick stabs and layering them, then re-recording the playback, more complex tones could be created that required only one voice. This was useful when voices on a hardware sampler were extremely limited. Another advantage was that effects could be added, and the cumulative output could be resampled to include them. This meant that increasingly complex tones could be created by adding effects, resampling, adding effects, resampling, adding effects, and resampling, etc., etc. This again saved on CPU power and created the ability to process sounds in crazy and complex manners. As an example, if a sampler had one instance of an effect like a flanger, multiple instances of that effect could be added by resampling over and over. Finally, if it was desirable, an entire phrase of music could be resampled and then processed using the sampler's internal modulations and routings, or just played back as a new loop. Collectively, all of these advantages also have one major disadvantage. In general, they're destructive forms of editing, as in, once something has been rendered and resampled, that was it. For example, if you resampled to include a reverb, there was no way of taking that reverb off if you decided you didn't like it without reverting to an earlier version of that patch. At its heart, and ignoring its virtual instruments, Ableton really is just one giant sampler, probably the most complex sampler of all time. Within Ableton, the ability exists to take a track which is playing and route it to another track's input, recording the sound, how it's being played, its melody, and its accompanying effects as one audio file. In addition, freezing and flattening can create an audio file out of a track, which can then be loaded into a sampler, and slicing to a new MIDI track allows for the quick loading of these sounds into one of Ableton's built-in sample playback devices. To be fair, though, many of the distinct advantages of resampling have actually been done away with by the giant increase in processing power, to the point where most of the time you actually don't really need to try and be frugal with your effects usage. There are still some big advantages for the synthesist, though. Let's have a quick look at a simple FM percussion sequence created using operator. In this case, operator A has a fixed pitch, and operator B, which is feeding FM into A, still tracks the keyboard. So we're going to play a simple melody based on 16th notes that's going to create a different series of complex harmonic FM interactions between these two operators. Remember that these sounds are being generated by harmonically arbitrary FM. They're hard to make work in a musical fashion due to their tone, their hard to define pitch, and their shifting nature. Any one of the sounds making up this sequence would be drastically different tonally if it was played using a different key, i.e., this FM tone at C3 will not track the keyboard up and down because of the fixed nature of one of the operators. Playing at C4, then, is not merely the sound from C3 up an octave, but an entirely different sound. If we take the percussion sequence and render it to audio, and then bring it into a sampler, all that changes. Now we can take one of the FM hits and play it chromatically. If we take time and tune it to a defined note, then we can actually use it musically. If the end result of our resampling is to re-import the rendered audio track back into a sampler that allows us to play it up and down the keyboard, then an important thing to remember is that any effects we add will also be transposed up and down that keyboard. This can work for or against you. Remember that any long spatial effects like delay or reverb will play back faster or slower depending on what you play, so you may not want to resample them. But certain effects like phaser, flanger, the redux or bit reduction, as well as hard to pin down effects like ring modulation or downsampling, will now track the keyboard as well, and this can actually be an advantage. In this case, I've added a phaser to our FM hit. If I play the hit up and down a few notes, you can hear that the phaser's effect stays static. If I find that I like the harmonic interaction of the phaser and the FM hit, and I want the relationship between them to stay the same and track the keyboard, then resampling is a really good option. Rather than automating a frequency change in this case, I'm going to resample the FM hit with the phaser applied, and now the phaser becomes part of that sound. So now when we take this clip of resampled audio and slice it to a new single sampler, we end up with a sample that we can play up and down the keyboard that actually has that phaser embedded within the sample. So the interaction between the phaser and our initial FM percussion hit stays the same and tracks the keyboard. This is a very good use of resampling, and we can have a quick listen now. Resampling is a powerful tool, but it can be problematic. It's a destructive form of editing, so be sure that whenever you resample, unless you're amazingly, unbelievably 100% committed to the sound that you're resampling, you keep a version of whatever you were working on so that if you decide you made a mistake, you can go back and resurrect what you were working on earlier. That said, it does allow us to take atonal hits and problematic elements and tune them and play them, as well as giving us the ability to add effects that can then be given a pitch or tonal quality that might be very hard to achieve in other manners.